It's Halloween season. We're all in the mood to watch horror movies, but which one is the best? I put together a horror movie bracket showdown. I picked 16 iconic horror films spanning 6 different decades, 16 different subgenres, and now we're going to determine which is the best. Let's fight. For our showdown, we have 2 different brackets, the classics and the modern era. In the classics, I'm looking at 8 different horror films from the 60s, 70s, and 80s. In the modern category, we have movies from the 90s, zeros, and the teens. I didn't include anything from the 20s. The way this is going to work is with each pairing, I get a vote, you get a vote, and if we disagree, we go to a tiebreaker. To get your vote, I put a series of polls up on my community tab over the last week. Over 100,000 votes were cast with all of these different possible pairings that could take place. And when we disagree, when there is a tie to be broken, I'm going to go to Rotten Tomatoes.
How dare you!
I know a lot of you hate it, but what I'm going to use is both the critic score as well as the audience score. Add the 2 together. Whichever of the movies has the higher combined Rotten Tomatoes score breaks the tie and moves on.
You did it! Congratulations!
And as much as I'm joking about us deciding the best horror film of all time, obviously there is no objective right answer to that. All of us just have our different opinions. With that in mind, I've posted the empty bracket over on my Twitter as well as my Instagram accounts. The links are down below in the description. If you fill out the bracket and post it on your stories or tweet it out and tag me, I'll reshare some of those to kind of share different opinions on how we all relate to these films. And let's get started kicking things off in the classics bracket. Our first pairing, Halloween versus Gremlins. Halloween, the John Carpenter classic that kicked off the slasher craze. It is my slasher pick for this list versus Gremlins, the 80s Amblin family horror film. When it comes to Halloween, we are talking about a movie that created the template that was followed by countless movies. The most obvious example being Friday the 13th, which was commissioned as a film to rip off Halloween. But Halloween has stood the test of time, still putting out blockbusters over the last few years, giving us beloved characters that have stood the test of time. Carpenter is a master of excellence with simplicity. But with Gremlins, you gave us the Mogwai, the Gremlins themselves, this weird lore about getting them wet. They can't eat after midnight. That doesn't make any sense. A fantastic score and just a really fun family franchise. When it comes to the poll, this one was an easy one. You definitively picked Halloween over Gremlins by, I believe, the highest margin out of any of these polls. A lot of the comments are saying, hey, I love Gremlins, but Halloween. It's Halloween. And as for my vote, it's for Halloween. Same thing. I love Gremlins. My 5-year-old is actually getting really into Gremlins. She's got her own little gizmo and watches the animated show on HBO Max, but come on, it's Halloween. Of course it wins. Second pairing, The Shining versus The Thing. With The Shining, you have the pairing between Stephen King with Stanley Kubrick and Jack Nicholson in the lead, filled with iconic shots, quotable lines, and of course, this is one of the most celebrated and influential horror films of all time. In fact, one of the local theaters here in Austin, Alamo Drafthouse South Lamar, just renovated the entire theater with The Shining theme. The carpet on the floor, there's a fake elevator with like blood projected on the ground. One of the theaters is called Room 237. That's just how iconic this film is. The other one on here, though, The Thing, a movie that when it first came out didn't get the most positive reviews. Siskel and Ebert called it the barf bag movie of the week.
But a lot of people who see it will be made sick by it.
I think that's probably an understatement. I would call this the barf bag movie of July.
But time has made it clear that this is one of the great sci-fi horror films of all time. It's another John Carpenter film. Fantastic gore effects in here that are practical, that to this day people think this is what gore is supposed to look like, not all this CGI crap that they keep putting out there. Now, when it comes to the poll on this one, two-thirds of you went for The Shining. The Thing had a very strong showing, But you guys definitively did pick The Shining. As for me, which one will I pick? I have to go with the truth here for me, and that is The Thing.
Why would they do this?
I've said it many times before. I am not on the same wavelength as Kubrick. I prefer Dr. Sleep to The Shining, and that's one of my hottest horror takes that I have, probably the hottest horror take that I have. But I've just never fully jived it. I respect it. I appreciate it. That means we have to break a tie for this one. So heading over to look at The Shining critic score. Only 83%, lower than you would expect. Audience score, 93% for a combined score of 176. Once again, like I said, I'm going to add the two together since you guys don't like the critics very much and want to have more input from the audience. Then when you look at The Thing, 85% critics score, which is a couple higher. Audience score, 92%, just a pinch lower. But that means when you combine the two, The Thing comes out ahead with 177 combined points. The tie is broken. We've got our first upset. The Thing moves on. For our third pairing, we have The Exorcist versus Child's Play. The iconic Exorcist possession movie versus the iconic killer doll movie. With The Exorcist, you have one of the most praised horror films of all time. It was nominated for Oscars. Its director was the sitting holder of a Best Picture and Best Director Oscar statues. It had incredible pedigree working on it. 50 years later, it is still the benchmark for possession films. And then you have Child's Play, the movie that gave us Chucky, an ongoing franchise that currently has a TV show in continuity with the movie, still going strong in its third season. When it comes to the poll, you guys 2/3 vote selected The Exorcist over Child's Play. Strong showing for Child's Play, but with The Exorcist definitely won the poll. As for me, I've got to go with The Exorcist as well. I feel that Child's Play is very good, but the franchise as a whole is more iconic than any one particular film in it, which is the exact opposite of The Exorcist, where the film is iconic and the franchise kind of sucks. But you got to go with The Exorcist on this one, so we both agree on it. Exorcist moves on. Final pairing of the classics bracket round one, Psycho versus A Nightmare on Elm Street. Hitchcock versus Craven. With Psycho, you have one of the earliest classic, iconic horror films, in particular in the sense of this one being a bit of a prototype of the slasher genre. One of the most iconic kills of all time, one of the most iconic scores of all time that's been mimicked, copied, all sorts of twists and turns that have just become part of the vernacular in talking about movies. And then you have A Nightmare on Elm Street, this definitive 80s horror film that fit in the slasher genre, but did something wildly different with it that was inventive. It gave us multiple iconic horror staples of the 80s. And it's one of those franchises, like, we've been waiting for a new movie because everyone's like, yeah, we gotta have another one of these, because you just want to spend more time playing around with this mythology. When it comes to the poll, you guys with a 60-40 vote picked A Nightmare on Elm Street over Psycho. Full credit to Psycho for all of its contributions to the horror genre, but if I'm being honest, which one of these movies do I gravitate towards? Have I watched dramatically more times? It, of course, is A Nightmare on Elm Street. I've got to push that one ahead. Moving over to the modern bracket, we have Scream versus Hereditary, self-aware meta horror versus A24 art house inspired horror. With Scream, you're talking about the horror films of my formative years in the late 90s, where Wes Craven, Kevin Williamson came up with this new formula that just ignited the slasher genre once again with this brand new flavor and created a franchise that all the way up to this year, we have new entries coming out. Other side to that, we have Hereditary, kind of this branch of A24 horror that is a little bit more psychological. It's denser, it's slower paced, has a lot of kind of packed ideas in it. The poll, by a large margin, it went to Scream, another one of the highest discrepancies between a pairing, with 80% for Scream, only 20% for Hereditary. I've said it many times before, Scream is my favorite horror film of all time, so that's obviously my vote. And as for just kind of Hereditary, I think it's good, but I'm not crazy about it either, so no question here, Scream moves on. Next up, Saw versus Get Out, and to use a pair of phrases that I have issues with and you in the comments section had issues with, but torture porn versus elevated horror. Saw kicked off the torture craze, a franchise that's still growing strong as of a month ago, with now 10 movies in the franchise. Jigsaw, this iconic character, and then you have Get Out, a fantastic debut from Jordan Peele that managed to be funny. It was socially aware, and it had plenty of horrifying ideas in it as well. When it comes to the poll, you guys went 2/3 for Get Out, 1/3 for Saw. A respectable showing for Saw, but clearly you guys picked Get Out. As for me, I don't think that the original Saw is a great film. I think it is a good film. I think the franchise as a whole is better than most of the individual films by a lot. So easily for me, I would also vote for Get Out on this one. Just like a fresh new spin on horror with a distinct voice, a distinct perspective. So easily Get Out moves on. Then we have Seven versus It. With Seven, I'm calling this dramatic horror, and then It, Stephen King coming of age horror. Seven is one of the most celebrated horrific thrillers of the last 30 years, one of the most iconic serial killers movies of all time, where you remember the concept, you remember the victims, you remember what's in the box, and then you have It, this massive hit film from about 5 years back, where they finally were able to capture the vibe of the first half of the book It by Stephen King, and it made bukus of dollars. When it comes to the poll, this one's really close, but Seven narrowly was victorious with 60% of the vote versus It. I'm a massive fan of both of these ones. It was one of my favorite horror films of the last decade, but I think that Seven is the movie that has stood the test of time better and is a better film overall. So my vote goes for Seven. Now, of all the movies included in this bracket, Seven is the one that by far the most people took issue that I included in this list, and a bunch of you don't consider it a horror film. Fair enough. Tell me why down below in the comment section. Is Seven a horror film? Should I have excluded it and thrown in Texas Chainsaw Massacre or Friday the 13th or something else? Or do you agree Seven is a horror film? It is gory. It is about a serial killer, and you do have horrifying sequences in it. Let me know down below. And the final pairing of round one, The Blair Witch Project versus The Conjuring. With The Blair Witch Project, this is the iconic found footage movie that kind of launched that subgenre into the mainstream and created a bunch of knockoffs. And then you have The Conjuring, the highest grossing horror franchise of all time. When it comes to the poll on this one, we've got quarter of the vote goes to Blair Witch Project and 3/4 go to The Conjuring. Now, Blair Witch Project, I think it is a solid viewing experience where it's worth a watch. Some people love it, some people hate it, but I think it is very effective at what it's going for. But when it comes to The Conjuring, this is once again what I would think is one of the best horror films of the last decade. It turned into such a popular franchise because they had a nice lore, solid set of characters, and demons that people were interested in. And so they took a genre that also has a very stiff competition where people always compare things to The Exorcist, and The Conjuring was able to stand out on its own. So I vote for The Conjuring on this one. So after our first 8 pairings, this is what the bracket looks like at the moment. Kicking off round 2 in the classics bracket, we have Halloween versus The Thing. John Carpenter slasher versus John Carpenter sci-fi body horror. Each of them are great. Each of them are highly influential in their own subgenres. Halloween has become the ongoing franchise that has had hit movies coming out very recently. The Thing only spawned one prequel that was not as well received. As for me, Halloween is by far the one that I have probably gone back and re-explored dramatically more than The Thing. I've only seen The Thing a handful of times, but those were mostly recent viewings, and it was one of those films like I watched it young and didn't appreciate it when I rewatched it recently. I was like, oh, this is a great paranoia thriller with sci-fi, with horror, with fantastic gore. Man, I should have been sleeping on this one for so long. On the poll, you guys picked Halloween at 62% over The Thing with 38%. Respectable showing for The Thing, but clearly Halloween was picked. As for me, I gotta go with the one that I've spent decades with rather than finally appreciating it more recently, so I have to vote for Halloween as well. Next up, The Exorcist, Possession versus Nightmare on Elm Street, Craven. This is a tough one because these are such different classics in such very different ways, and each of them were so influential at their time in their own ways. With The Exorcist, you have almost this prestige drama that's also a horror film, and then with A Nightmare on Elm Street, you just have this wildly creative film that fit into that 80s slasher genre at the same time. When it comes to the polls on this one, you guys voted at 62% for A Nightmare on Elm Street versus 38% for The Exorcist. As for me, rewatching The Exorcist recently and doing a deep dive into it with the history and all the things that it kind of stands for, and having rewatched A Nightmare on Elm Street quite a few times, I'm actually going to vote for The Exorcist on this one. With The Nightmare on Elm Street, I think it's great on just a personal taste level. I really enjoy it. There are a number of things about it that I think are a bit dated, and it gets very Home Alone in the third act in a way that feels a little bit silly in light of everything else. Exorcist, rewatching it, doing this deep dive, I just had this new appreciation for it in a lot of ways. Going over to the tiebreaker with The Exorcist, critics only gave it a 78%, but an 87% audience score for a total of 165 combined points. Nightmare on Elm Street, 95% from the critics, 84% audience score for 179 versus 65. The tiebreaker goes to the poll, and A Nightmare on Elm Street moves forward. Over on the modern bracket, we have Scream versus Get Out. And this is a bit of a fun pairing because there's certain similarities here. Each of them spawned a bunch of knockoffs in their time. Each of them has a commentary aspect to them, and each of them has a sense of humor while being two very different films that were influential in very different ways. When it comes to the poll, 73% of the vote went to Scream, 27% to Get Out. You guys easily picked Scream. As for me, of course, it's my favorite movie. My vote goes to Scream, but full props to Get Out. It's a very good recent horror film. Final pairing of round two, Seven versus The Conjuring. We'll head right over to the poll on this one. The Conjuring, 38%, Seven, 62%. As for my vote, Conjuring's one of the great horror films of the last decade. Seven is one of the great films of my lifetime. Gotta go for Seven on this one. Seven moves on, much to the chagrin of those of you that don't think that it's a horror film. Real quick before we move on to the semifinals, be sure to join me down below. Let me know your thoughts on the decisions of each of the rounds, or if you're up for it, download that image over on Twitter, X, or my Instagram page. Fill out your own bracket. Tag me when you share it on your stories in a tweet, and I will retweet or reshare some of those on my stories. Also, if you enjoy my commentary here and want to hear more about all of this, every movie on this list except for Psycho, I have covered in more detail in a ranking or a review. Most of those are in rankings. You can check out my horror rankings somewhere around here when this video's over with. In the semifinals, in the classics bracket, we have Halloween versus A Nightmare on Elm Street. Carpenter versus Craven. Michael Myers versus Freddy Krueger. Both of them launched franchises that spanned multiple decades. Both of them gave us iconic killers. Both of them are from like the Mount Rushmore of horror directors. But who moves on? The poll went 76% versus 24% to Halloween. As for me, I'm also going to vote for Halloween for many of the same reasons that I mentioned in the last round of. There's just a few things about A Nightmare on Elm Street that I just don't think have aged very well at all. Whereas with Halloween, it stood the test of time. Maybe the pacing's a little bit slow based off modern sentiments, but it laid the foundation that was so pivotal. My vote is for Halloween. Halloween moves on to the finals. Then we have Scream versus Seven. Both of these are mid-90s horror films. Both of them are movies that were a part of shaping me as a person that loves movies. And as I was getting into horror films, these are some of the ones that everybody was talking about. On the one hand, you have a horror film with a sense of humor that has the scares and the kills, but also makes you laugh a little bit. And then you have Seven, a very bleak, depressing horror film that I actually rewatched last night, and man, it's a good one. But in the polls, you guys went 74% versus 26%. Scream over Seven. Seven had a very strong performance all the way up until the semifinals. You guys picked Scream easily. And of course, Scream is my favorite horror film. So my vote in any round with Scream in it will be for Scream. Scream moves on to the finals, and we have Halloween, the movie that kicked off the slasher craze, versus Scream, the movie that revitalized the slasher genre and commented on all of the tropes that Halloween kicked off nearly 20 years before it came out. Which movie will come out on top? As has been said before, Halloween laid the template that was copied by countless films, and that was made fun of by the movie Scream. It is intentionally simplistic, but it brings in someone like Loomis to give an urgency to it that drives the story forward, gives us that ticking clock as we race to save the day, see who will find who first. But with Scream, you add in that whodunit element, that 90s flavor, very pop cultural aware, a killer soundtrack. But when it comes to the final poll, this one is really close. Of the polls, of the pairings that made it into the final bracket, this is actually the closest one we've had yet, and that's fitting, because we're talking about the leaders of each of the two brackets, depending on if you're into modern things, if you're into the classic era, if you like a little humor, if you like things a little bit more straightforward, this one should be really close. 54% of the vote goes to Halloween versus 46% of the vote going to Scream. You guys picked Halloween, but as I already said, in every single one of these pairings, I'm voting for Scream because Scream is my favorite horror film of all time. It is the one that shaped me the most in my taste when it comes to horror films. And it's one of the movies that got me into watching these other horror films. My vote goes to Scream. That means we go to the tiebreaker. Looking at Scream, we've got an 81% plus an 80% good but not great scores for a total of 161. But with Halloween, it's 96% from critics, 89% from the audience for a total score of 185, easily defeating Scream. The tie has been broken. The poll won out over my taste, and that means the victor of our tournament is Halloween by our very, very objective standards and polling system here. Halloween is the greatest horror movie of all time. If you want to see more showdowns like this, I've done a couple other ones in the past. You can check them out in that playlist right over there. If you would want to see more of my horror rankings, check those out right down there. I've done like all of the major horror franchises. Thank you so much for watching, and keep talking movies and TV too much. Bye-bye.